Before the television empire, before the conventions and the fan theories, there was a desert, a stone ring, and a production that almost came apart. Kurt Russell nearly walked away without ever understanding the real script. James Spader thought the dialogue would stain his career, and Roland Emmerich was trying to prove that ancient gods were not a bedtime story, but an occupation. What happened behind that circular door is stranger than the fiction itself. The gate that almost killed the movie. The first time the Stargate prop was rolled under studio lights, it didn't look like destiny. It looked like a tire. A giant matte black 22-foot ring standing upright in the middle of a soundstage, heavy and flat, absorbing every ounce of light thrown at it. The carved glyphs that were supposed to suggest ancient power instead looked shallow and dull. Under test footage, it felt less like a portal to another world and more like an expensive mistake. Dean Devlin later acknowledged that everyone on set understood the truth immediately. If the gate didn't work, nothing worked. The film depended on that object more than on any actor, any line of dialogue, or any explosion. The problem wasn't craftsmanship. The ring had weight, it had detail, it had scale. But black paint under intense studio lighting flattened it completely. Shadows disappeared. Texture vanished. It felt inert, and an inert Stargate meant an inert movie. So they did something drastic. Between shooting days, under production pressure, and against the clock, the entire ring was repainted metallic silver. Not touched up, not slightly adjusted. Completely transformed. It was a gamble made in exhaustion and fear. Silver reacts differently. It reflects. It bends light. It carries highlight and shadow in a way that makes carvings appear deeper than they are. When the floodlights hit it again, something shifted. The glyphs caught fire along their edges. Torches flickered across its surface and the metal shimmered. Under moonlight setups, it seemed charged, almost awake. It was still the same physical object. But psychologically, it changed everything. The gate no longer sat there. It dominated the frame. And that visual shift was not happening in a vacuum. The film had already been turned down by major American studios who believed science fiction was losing momentum. Executives saw ancient Egypt, wormholes, alien gods, and no built-in franchise safety net. They passed. Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin were forced to look beyond Hollywood for belief. Financing came largely from Europe, with Studio Canal stepping in when others would not. MGM later distributed the film, but the money had already been secured through risk. With a production budget hovering around $55 million, there was no cushion. Every delay meant financial bleed. Every reshoot threatened collapse. The gate was not just a prop. It was a symbol of whether the gamble would hold. That urgency infected the entire production. Cast and crew felt it. There was an awareness that they were building something that could either look monumental or ridiculous. There was no middle ground. If audiences laughed at the gate, the mythology would crumble before it began. Once the silver transformation worked, something else happened quietly. The filmmakers began treating the gate not simply as machinery, but as relic and myth. In the story, it would later be identified as being made of naquata, a fictional element capable of storing immense energy. But on set, what gave it power was simpler: real material responding to real light. No digital trick could replicate that honesty at the time. The reflections were not simulated. They were physical. That decision to rely on tangible physics rather than hiding behind visual effects would define the film's aesthetic. It also raised expectations for everything that followed. Because if the gate looked that convincing, then the wormhole inside it had to feel equally real. And that's when the next crisis began. The gate was saved by paint and desperation, but what waited behind it would demand something far more unstable: scripts, standoffs, and a trailer that went silent. James Spader did not fall in love with the script. When the early draft of Stargate reached him, He reportedly found it awkward and tonally confused, unsure whether it wanted to be an academic exploration of ancient civilizations or a loud science fiction adventure built on spectacle. At that point in his career, Spader had built a reputation on more grounded, character-driven roles. He was not chasing explosions or mythology. He was navigating a transitional period, trying to decide what kind of actor he wanted to be next. The script felt strange to him. Not polished, not refined, but strangely compelling in its imbalance. He later admitted that part of what drew him in was precisely that imperfection. It didn't feel calculated. It felt unstable. And instability can be interesting to an actor. Daniel Jackson wasn't a conventional action hero. He was awkward, stubborn, socially isolated, and academically dismissed. That vulnerability appealed to Spader, but that didn't mean he trusted the dialogue. Kurt Russell's hesitation came from a different place. The version of the script that first reached him portrayed Colonel Jack O'Neill as little more than a disciplined soldier with a weapon and a mission. Russell saw no depth, no emotional weight. He declined without much discussion. It was only after producer persistence and a corrected shooting draft that he reconsidered. The revised script gave O'Neill something more dangerous than gunfire: grief, a father who had buried a child, a man who carried silence like armor. That emotional foundation changed everything. Once Russell understood the character's internal conflict, he committed. His reported $7 million salary was not just compensation, it was leverage. His involvement reassured foreign investors and anchored international sales. In an independently financed production that had already been rejected by major American studios, that mattered. But the script issues didn't vanish when filming began. They escalated. At one point during production, Spader reportedly refused to leave his trailer over dialogue concerns. He believed certain lines would damage credibility. He didn't want Daniel Jackson reduced to exposition. The standoff froze the schedule. Crew members waited. Time translated directly into financial loss. Russell confronted him. The exchange that followed has become part of film lore. When Spader argued that the dialogue was terrible, Russell responded bluntly, "Of course it's terrible. That's why you're being paid. If it were perfect, you'd do it for free." It wasn't an insult. It was a reminder that filmmaking is commerce as much as craft. The production didn't implode. Devlin and Emmerich rewrote pages on set. Adjustments were made quickly, sometimes within hours. Dialogue was sharpened to fit Spader's cadence. Sarcasm replaced stiffness. Reaction replaced explanation. The changes were subtle but significant. Daniel Jackson became less of a walking thesis and more of a human being trying to process something impossible. At the same time, the opening excavation sequence was being shot under intense time pressure in Arizona. The 1928 dig feels expansive and monumental, yet it was filmed in only a few days. Partial sets were constructed. Distant laborers were simulated with simple cloth-draped figures placed strategically in wide shots. The crew scheduled key takes during late afternoon to capture natural golden light, stretching limited resources into something cinematic. Nothing about the production felt relaxed. Scripts were being reshaped. Performances were being recalibrated. Financial pressure lingered behind every decision. But rather than weakening the film, that strain seemed to refine it. The arguments forced clarity. The compromises demanded precision. And while actors wrestled with words, another battle was brewing quietly. The visual effects team was about to discover that the real fight wouldn't be over dialogue at all. It would be over physics. The garage experiment that changed everything. The Stargate's liquid surface, the unstable blast before it stabilizes, is remembered as pure science fiction spectacle. In truth, it began in a garage. Visual effects supervisor Jeffrey Oken faced repeated rejection from Roland Emmerich. Ideas were pitched and dismissed. At one point, Okun was told to leave, more than once. The director wanted something mechanical, not smooth, something unnatural. In a plexiglass tank filled with water and iced tea powder to give it density, Okun and cinematographer David Stump experimented with turbulence. A wooden beam attached to a drill stirred the liquid. When the swirl settled, they saw the spiral that would become the portal's signature texture. To create the explosive outward surge, compressed air was fired into the tank. Early tests used too much pressure, blasting water across equipment and drenching crew members. Eventually, they fine-tuned the force to create a controlled eruption. The result was filmed at high speed, around 120 frames per second, then composited frame by frame. Rendering the wormhole travel sequence required roughly a month of computer time, which in the mid-90s was a serious commitment. There was no instant playback. Much of the compositing was done in the photochemical era, blending film layers with optical printers and early digital tools. Late in post-production, editors decided the film needed 66 additional visual effects shots. Not in pre-production, not months out. In the final week before delivery, using an early real-time compositing system known as Domino, the effects team pushed through what should have been impossible. Shots involving the pyramid ship, desert skylines, and explosions were added under brutal deadlines. And then there were the morphs. The serpent guard helmets folding mechanically over human faces took nearly 9 months to perfect. Off-the-shelf morphing software failed. Ears drifted across frames. Faces collapsed incorrectly. The team wrote custom tools to create what Emmerich described as negative space, objects folding into dimensions that felt physically wrong. The transformations are slightly imperfect even today. That imperfection is what makes them unsettling. For the later television series, the morph was rarely shown. It was too expensive, too complex. The film achieved something the franchise would learn to imply rather than repeat. But spectacle wasn't the only strain. The desert itself had plans of its own: heat, lawsuits, and a villain who never wanted fame. The Egyptian world was filmed around Yuma, Arizona, where temperatures regularly climbed above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Water bottles melted if left exposed. Cameras jammed from overheating. Footprints in sand ruined wide shots and had to be erased repeatedly. Actors inside Horus Guard helmets faced almost no ventilation. The glowing eyes were powered by small battery packs taped inside. Some performers nearly fainted. The Mastadge creature was originally designed as a full-scale suit placed over a horse. It proved too heavy. The animal couldn't move properly. The solution was humiliating and clever. Miniatures and even a dog pulling a scaled-down prop were used for certain shots. Framed correctly, it felt enormous. J. Davidson's casting added another layer of unpredictability. Discovered in London and propelled to fame through an Oscar-nominated performance, Davidson never intended to build a long acting career. When approached for the role of Ra, he reportedly asked for $1 million, assuming the offer would disappear. It did not. He accepted. On set, the elaborate costume, heavy headdress, and layered fabrics created physical strain. He struggled with dialogue delivery at times. The final film reshaped Ra in post-production, adding voice modulation and revealing an alien parasite form to intensify his presence. After filming, Davidson largely stepped away from Hollywood. The director's cut later restored a scene depicting a young boy abducted to become Ra's host. It reframed the villain as something parasitic rather than purely tyrannical, adding a layer of tragedy. The production also faced a legal challenge. An Oklahoma teacher named Omar Zudi claimed the premise resembled a script he had written years earlier titled Egypt Cape. The case was settled out of court, and details were never fully disclosed. The shadow lingered briefly, but it did not derail the film's release. Even small continuity choices became important. After early scenes were filmed, Kurt Russell's hair color was brightened slightly to maintain visual consistency under harsh lighting. It seems minor. It wasn't. Under desert sun and interior facility lights, Subtle changes affected how the character read on screen. Nothing about the production was smooth, and yet, when it opened in October, it did so at number 1. A miracle that refused to close. Opening weekend numbers surprised industry watchers. October was not prime blockbuster territory, yet the film debuted strongly and went on to earn nearly $200 million worldwide against its $55 million budget. That performance validated the risk of financing outside traditional studio comfort zones. Inside the Spruce Goose Dome in Long Beach, massive interior sets had been constructed to house the Earth Stargate facility. The space allowed for catwalks, scaffolding, and the towering ring itself. The dome's acoustics created echo problems, but the scale gave the military installation authenticity. The theatrical version of the film moved quickly, trimming Daniel Jackson's longer academic lecture for pacing. The director's cut leaned slightly more into anthropology and myth. The theatrical version leaned into momentum. Studio pressure had demanded more action, more spectacle. Emmerich and Devlin fought to protect the emotional core. O'Neill's grief remained intact. Jackson's curiosity remained fragile. The film used 39 symbols on the gate. When Stargate SG-1 premiered, the mythology shifted to 38 symbols plus a point of origin to allow for expanded storytelling. The absence of a dial-home device in the film forced the military to rely on computers and manual rotation. The series standardized the system. Fans still debate the differences. What was meant to be a single cinematic experience evolved into a 10-season television phenomenon, followed by additional spin-offs and direct-to-DVD films. The miracle became routine. The doorway became infrastructure. But the strangest part is this: it almost didn't hold together. A mispainted prop, a script that nearly lost its leads, effects that flooded equipment, a desert that refused to cooperate, a villain who never planned to stay. Every piece threatened collapse at some point, and yet it survived. Which behind-the-scenes moment surprised you the most? The silver repaint, the garage water tank, or the cast standoff? Let me know in the comments and subscribe if you want more stories where the chaos behind the camera is just as intense as what made it on screen.